Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and certainly we welcome you to the broadcast. Love to get your comments today, especially as we're going to get into a number of different issues about whether some of these models that caused the lockdown were really fraudulent or at least inadequate. But one of our articles actually suggests that some of those were intentionally fraudulent, so we'll get into that. Also, a very good piece that came out by Victor Davis Hanson on the arts of government criminality, which is really relevant since now in the United States Senate, there are some investigations being brought, one by Lindsey Graham and another one by Charles Grassley, along with Senator Johnson. And so the criticism that has come from the Senate Minority Leader, Charles Schumer, is this is all a wild conspiracy that the Republicans should not pursue. Of course, that's in the Senate. A lot of that's being pursued by the Justice Department, and they don't think it's a conspiracy. They actually have pretty good evidence to show it's anything but. So we'll get to that in just a minute. And I thought I might just, as a program note, mention that an hour from now, we'll have Chuck Bentley with us. He is, of course, the CEO of Crown Financial, been with us so many times before. It is the largest Christian financial ministry in the world, and he has written a special article for Point of View. Now, he may reprint it somewhere else as well, but it's entitled Time to Practice COVID Capitalism, Protecting Lives and Livelihoods, and we'll get into some of that with him in about an hour. I wasn't going to cover this story, but it was the lead story in the Drudge Report, and it got me thinking that sometimes a story that was worth covering and maybe even giving you some good information can be used in another way. And the story, which was the lead story for most of the morning and just changed a few minutes ago on the Drudge Report, was something that appeared in The Hill called Two Southern Churches Forced to Reclose After Leaders and Congregants Get the Coronavirus. Now, first of all, you've got to understand that these are only two churches. So put this in perspective for just a minute. There may be some other churches that have closed, but the fact that it was two churches and Southern churches, and then, of course, you mentioned the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and I don't know if they mentioned the governor of Texas. I don't see Greg Abbott's name in there, but the implication is there. It's kind of like, well, see, that's why we shouldn't open up the churches in the first place. And before we even get into the reality of the story, you have to also ask yourself, was this really the lead? Should this have been the lead in the Drudge Report, one that everybody around the world would see? And you have to put that in some perspective, because we have about 300,000 churches in America. I do not know even what the order of magnitude is of churches that have opened either this Sunday or the Sunday before. But let's just assume, even if it's 10%, that would mean that there would be, and I think the 10% number may be low, whether it's 8% or 15% or whether it's 20 or 30%, I do not know. But even taking the lowest number you can come up with, 10%, that's 30,000 churches. And now two of them, one Protestant church, one Catholic church, have decided to close their doors for now. Is that a big story? Well, it's worth doing a story about. Is it worth being the lead story? I think you can kind of get a sense that maybe people have overreacted a little bit. But if you look at this, I think the story, which we haven't posted, but you can certainly find it because it's out there on the internet, looks at a church in Georgia. It looks like kind of a standard Baptist church, it looks like a King James only church as I've looked at their doctrinal statement. But almost as soon as it talks about the fact that there were a few families that might have the virus, it immediately quotes, of course, what happened when the governor, Brian Kemp, opened up Georgia, which, by the way, Georgia has done relatively well, even though it opened much earlier. And if I can quote from the church, it said, because this is an article that's in Christian Post, seating was marked to only permit sitting within the 6-foot guidelines. All doors were open to allow access without touching the doors, and attendees were asked to enter in a social distancing manner and were dismissed in a formal manner as to ensure that social distancing measures were adhered to by all. Looks like they were very efficient in what they did. This Friday, we will probably get into that again because we have Dr. Merrill Matthews, and of course he, along with Andrew, who's our engineer, we're at Denton Bible, and a lot of people, including my own church, have been looking, how did Denton Bible do? And so I think they did the right thing, but okay, some people come down with a virus. Do we know they got that from the church? Actually, if you think about that, we don't know that because we know there's an incubation period. If, for example, the church was open this Sunday and now people are testing positive, you could say for certain they didn't pick it up on the church. If the church was open 2 weeks ago, maybe. And so there are some real questions about the conclusions being drawn. And by the way, there's a very good article that I may get to later that is entitled Media Outlets Mislead Readers About the COVID-19 Data. And part of that is if you see a spike days after a state is opened, and you blame it on the spike, you can't because we know the incubation period isn't long enough. But nevertheless, that's one of those. So that's Protestant church. Then we, of course, have the Catholic Church. This was a Houston-based Holy Ghost parish in which one of the fathers, actually, who's 79 years of age, had died. They thought he had pneumonia. And so maybe the assumption is he has it. But, of course, they now have found that there were some other people in the community, including 2 priests, that have been active in celebrating these public masses, which, again, if you think about the way in which communion is done, say, in a Catholic church compared to a Protestant church, maybe that's the case. But nevertheless, it's just one of those examples of, okay, we have 2 churches that have decided to close their doors, end of story, until it becomes the lead story in the Drudge, and you have to sort of say, is there an agenda? Well, we'll see where it goes from there. We'll see what kind of comments are made, but I thought I'd mention it. And since we're talking about some of the things that people say in the faith community, you probably have also seen this if you've gone to the Drudge Report. There are people that have noticed that there are hailstones that look like the coronavirus. And so they're now arguing that these coronavirus-shaped hailstones are a message from God to stay at home. Please. These are the kinds of things that certainly give the church and Christians a bad name. But again, that's one of the other articles that you can see there on the website. And you have to roll your eyes on this one. And I wasn't going to bring this one up, but that's how the particular conversation today started on the Rush Limbaugh program. Mark Stein was actually the host, and he talked about the locust swarms in Iran, and they are now listed as the biblical locust swarms because it looks like a plague or a pestilence of biblical proportions is so incredible that if you look at this picture here, it literally has blocked out the sun. And so we've had some of these locust plagues that have run all the way through Africa. Now you have them in Iran. And the military in Iran is trying to do what they can to address some of these swarms of locusts. So that's all for some of the silliness sometimes that takes place under the faith community. But when we come back, let's get into some more significant issues. What about those models that were used to justify the lockdown? What about some of the questions being raised about the investigation in any kind of malfeasance done by the previous administration? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As various states are loosening stay-at-home orders, we're seeing more and more people in public spaces. But there are a significant number of Americans who aren't coming out anytime soon. The media naturally will focus on the number of people at stores, malls, and parks and probably ignore people staying home. A survey commissioned by Vital Veo concluded that 40% of Americans plan to avoid public spaces unless absolutely necessary long after the coronavirus pandemic has subsided. The survey was of 1,000 U.S. adults and isn't a perfect survey of American attitudes, but does give us a hint to what we might expect over the next few months. Digging down into the survey, you can also discover that about a third will wait a few weeks and a quarter will wait 1 or 2 months. Even more surprising was the fact that some respondents, 16%, said that they were unsure that they would ever feel comfortable out in public again. When I've shared that last statistic, many people have trouble believing it. But think about who that might be in that percentage. It would certainly include people in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. It would likely include people who have a suppressed immune system due to chemotherapy or other factors. It would also include people who already had signs of agoraphobia or paranoid fears. I might also mention that these concerns not only will influence whether some people will feel comfortable in public places, but how they will feel in other people's homes. A majority said that they would be suspicious about their friends' and families' hygiene habits. This might even change our traditions of family reunions and Thanksgiving dinners. The lockdown seems to be changing some of our perceptions about public spaces and even family gatherings. This might be one more example of moving into a new normal. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, one of the sad realities of the fact that because we have such a politicized culture, even medical studies and medical research and pharmaceutical kinds of regimens become politicized. If I ever had the ear of the President of the United States, which I don't, I would suggest to him that he would maybe be a lot better off if he didn't mention the kinds of drugs he was taking, because it's just going to create a firestorm. But I'm for sure he's probably never had an unexpressed thought, so that's not the case. But here is another example coming from two very reputable doctors. One is an associate professor and chief of pediatric allergy, immunology, and rheumatology at UCLA School of Medicine. The other is a molecular biologist, in which they talk about the political assault on antibody tests. Now, if it's in the Wall Street Journal, it's one of those ones where you go, this couldn't possibly be true. Apparently it is. And he points out, these two authors point out, I should say, that tests for the antibodies for the virus, for COVID-19, are available. But many physicians are advising their patients that antibodies may not provide immunity. And they point out that the assertion really defies generations of research in immunology, and they believe is a political attack on these tests. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I was one of those that wondered, at least initially, whether or not having the antibodies for this disease would give you immunity, because we saw, as we've pointed out numerous occasions in South Korea, that there were indeed some individuals that after they had the virus tested positive for having the virus in their system again. We now have concluded that those tests were just so accurate and so sensitive, they were picking up remnants of the RNA from the virus in the first place, and so it does seem that there is the case. Well, the two authors here, both whom are very well-credentialed doctors, point out how the immune system works, and I won't get into too much of this, but there are two kinds of things. There's what's called innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Stay with me because I'm not going to stay into it for very long. The innate immunity comes within minutes to hours after maybe you had the virus in your system, and immediately your cells produce what are called interferons. These are molecules that just incapacitate viruses, and they get your white blood cell count up, and that's good. And for mild infections, that's all that you need. But then for some individuals, you have what's called adaptive immune responses that happens about 4 or 5 days later. That's where you get your T cells and all sorts of other things, and I won't go into literally paragraphs where they describe it in exquisite and maybe even hard to understand medical detail. If you do read this article, just skip over that and come down to some of their conclusion of their paragraphs, because they point out that given the reliability and the performance of these tests, it appears to be politics, not science, behind the claim that the presence of specific antibodies in those who've recovered doesn't indicate protective immunity. And they said, this is baffling. If it's true, how does anyone recover, they say, from a severe infection? And so the only question we really still have is what's called durability. Will your immunity last for a lifetime as it does when you get a cold or a virus? Or will it be, I guess the best example is tetanus. You know, if you ever step on a nail or you cut yourself, and all of us guys, we've done this over the years, the first thing the doctor says, okay, when's the last time you had your tetanus because that needs a booster from time to time, okay? But that's the only real question we have left, and they're beginning to wonder if a lot of this is simply because they don't want to say that these people are healthy, or maybe they are reacting to what we talked about before, this idea of having an immunity passport, that if you have the antibodies, then you're safe because you won't get the disease again. I don't know, but nevertheless, they conclude this by saying, so far, the data has shown that COVID-19 is more widespread and less lethal than previously thought. More antibody data will enable better policy. These accurate and sensitive tests should be made widely available, not disparaged. And so they are concerned that there are doctors and other people in the healthcare professionals that are really spending some time now questioning the value of these antibody tests. Don't know what's going on there, but I just thought I would mention it. And getting out to the first article I've posted here, this is by Julie Kelly. Came out a couple of days ago. And again, just reminding us of the first studies that came out by Dr. Neil Ferguson, an epidemiologist at Imperial College. And he is the one that really coined the term social distancing. Now, a lot of people want to call it physical distancing, in which the Imperial College model assumed that 2.2 million Americans would die of this disease without immediate and draconian measures, and that more than 80% of Americans would be infected. So then, by proposing the idea of social distancing and a variety of other things, you might be able to mitigate some of that infection. And so they point out that, first of all, this model was used, and the very strong statements being used by Dr. Neil Ferguson, who later actually now has stepped down because the argument was he violated his own rules. I think he also stepped down so he couldn't get sued, but nevertheless, that's the case. And he was the one, you might remember, that insisted that these rules would have to stay into effect for 18 months until a vaccine was found. So that is a reminder of what was said just a few months ago. And so now you've had some individuals, primarily with Microsoft, interestingly enough, and a variety of others, that have actually looked at the code, and they refer to it as a buggy code. Okay, as a person that sometimes wrote inadequate computer code. I know exactly what they're talking about there. And the code that was originally used is decades old, first of all. And after a few weeks, it had to be revised. As a matter of fact, one software engineer that did a very thorough analysis of that said that all papers based on this code should be retracted immediately. The Imperial College modeling efforts should be reset with a new team that isn't under Professor Ferguson. Of course, he's not there now, as I pointed out. And so this has led at least a few individuals. Matt Ridley, who's the author of a number of award-winning scientific books, raised this question: did we base one of the biggest peacetime policy decisions on crude mathematical guesswork? The answer seems to be yes. So that's the Imperial College model. Now, if you've been listening to this program over the last couple of months, you know that we moved pretty quickly then, once there were some real questions about that, to another model, and that's a model out of the University of Washington produced by Christopher Murray. It's oftentimes referred to as the Murray model. He is the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle. But again, you see all sorts of graphs and charts that were based upon the Murray model, one that was cited constantly by Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci. And oftentimes you would see some of those charts even as President Donald Trump was actually speaking. And so, again, the president, with those models and with the confirmation from Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci, basically said that I guess we have to shut everything down. And they first implemented that for 15 days, extended it to April 13th. And, of course, as this has been going on, the so-called Murray model out of Seattle has been, as of when this paper came out, updated 16 times since its March 26 release. So, if nothing else, what have we encountered? Well, if nothing else, so far 36 million people and counting have applied for unemployment. Critical health care services have been delayed. We've talked about some of the problems there. Students have been out of school for at least 5 months. And economists are predicting in this particular article a double-digit drop in the economic growth for at least the next quarter. And yesterday, if you happen to hear the conversation we had in the third hour with Jerry Tuma, we went into all the other issues as well. One other thing that the Murray model did not do, it completely overlooked one very dangerous sector, and that was nursing homes. It turns out that nursing homes were not part of that model. And again, if you look at some of the numbers, at least half of the total number of fatalities from the coronavirus actually were either in nursing homes or long care facilities or tied to them in one way or another. And, of course, as we've pointed out before, you've had governors in New York like Andrew Cuomo and California Governor Gavin Newsom that oftentimes mix those individuals that might have been infected with the nursing homes and led to a lot of the death that we now talk about. So if you'd like to read a little bit more about these models and the consequences of them, this is the first article we've posted by Julie Kelly. And even though I knew parts of this, as I read through that particular article, I was shocked at how much more we're now learning. Unfortunately, much too late. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
1-800-351-1212. Going to spend some time talking about this issue, and if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call. About a half an hour, we're going to have Chuck Bentley with us, and we'll talk about his piece called Covid Capitalism, Protecting Lives and Livelihoods. Very well written. He wrote it for us, and we have posted it on the website. Our second article, which I'll get to in just a minute, but I want to set it up, is entitled The Arts of Government Criminality, and it's by Victor Davis Hanson, and I won't even read all of it because it is so lengthy, but it is something I would encourage you to read in its entirety, but I'll give you a brief summary. But the reason for it is best illustrated by an article that came out this morning in The Hill, and it says simply, tensions are flaring in the Senate as Republicans are preparing to ramp up their investigations into Obama-era officials. Now, we're talking about multiple investigations, one that is actually being headed up by Senator Ron Johnson, which is, I understand, also being worked with by Senator Chuck Grassley, and a second one by Senator Lindsey Graham. Now, I might also point out that, first of all, these are somewhat seen as risky, and Lindsey Graham is running for re-election and is considered somewhat vulnerable. So the argument that sometimes is made is, well, they brought this up because they really want to defend the president or they want to help their reelection. My argument would be just the opposite. Lindsey Graham, by venturing into something that is going to be somewhat controversial, but I think necessary, runs the risk of not being reelected. So as you hear me quoting from Chuck Schumer or Dick Durbin and some of the Democrats that are criticizing the Republicans as being an election year stunt, you've got to also understand that some of these individuals would probably be better if they just kind of went and campaigned in their state and ignored this in its entirety. The other part about this is people say, why now? Well, that's because of the election. Well, no, why now is because for the first time, we actually have some of these documents that have been dug up in large part because of the research being done by the Department of Justice. And even if you were to say that this is nothing more than a stunt, let's remind everybody that the fact that this is even taking place in the Senate is due to the fact that there is some Republican control there, and Republicans couldn't even slow down, much less interrupt what has been taking place in the House of Representatives, which ultimately was used as the impeachment process against the president. So all that as a background, let's get into it, because their argument here is that some of this is the pressure being brought on by the president. There may be some truth to that, I don't know, but it again goes to the origins of this Russian investigation, the FISA Act, and even some of the things involving Hunter Biden. I think they'd be smart if they just left that last part out, because it just looks like you're going after the son of the presumptive Democratic nominee, and I think you can deal with enough of it as it is. But nobody asked my opinion. But nevertheless, Chuck Schumer the other day railed against the Republicans, saying they were chasing a wild conspiracy theory, which is why before we're out this hour, I'm going to talk about the article by David Harsanyi, which we've talked about before. And yesterday, Guy Benson quotes from that article, which we've posted. I always feel good when I see a prominent national columnist quoting from some of the same articles we've posted on the website. Makes me feel like, okay, maybe we are on to the right track. But nevertheless, what Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, is doing right now is asking for the Judiciary Committee to give him subpoena authority to call dozens of officials to testify over the FISA court applications over what was called Crossfire Hurricane, which was the name of the FBI investigation into the Russian election collusion. And he said, we're going to investigate the investigators and try to find out how Crossfire Hurricane got off the rails. Meanwhile, you also have, as I mentioned just a minute ago, another investigation, and this one is by Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. Also working with him is Chuck Grassley of Iowa. By the way, they're not running for re-election, and they're doing an investigation into Hunter Biden and the holdings in Burisma. And this would be an attempt to try to investigate that as well, and also try to get some clarification on the fact that at that time, Vice President Joe Biden actually worked to remove the Ukrainian prosecutor, which looks like in order to protect his son. And so as a result, that's something that'll be investigated in another committee as well.
So you're starting to see more and more controversy in the midst of all of this. And so the Democrats have suggested what they might do is they'll just simply avoid going to these committee meetings in the Judiciary and in Homeland Security. By skipping those meetings, though, they've said, well, that may not make any difference because the Republicans have the vote and they'll continue on anyway. And I would at least say to those individuals that think that that's inappropriate, just remember what was happening in the House when oftentimes the Republicans were completely shut out of some of those investigations. Doesn't make it right, but you can certainly say that you don't have as much of a reason to criticize that because you didn't see anything wrong with it when it was your party doing it. And I would rather that we were to actually have both Republicans and Democrats sit in a committee meeting, act like adults, have a vote. If you lose your vote, that's the way it is. Go to win next time. And that would be the way we would normally do it, but this is not the world that we live in. Which brings me now to the piece that I've posted. This is a very good article, and of course it is amazing how many times I find myself pulling an article by Victor Davis Hanson and appreciating that. And he calls it The Arts of Government Criminality, because what he is trying to do is take just mountains of information and summarize those in less than 10 pages. Still, if you print this out on your printer, make sure you got enough paper there, because he takes you through each one of these examples, and he gives us 4 rough categories that he puts all the data under. The first is what's called the deletion of evidence. And that goes on for quite a while. And we're not just talking about the one that everybody talks about, and that is Hillary Clinton, who was able to delete 33,000 emails that were subpoenaed by the FBI, claiming that they were private and not work-related, but nobody got to see them but her. Imagine if, you are being subpoenaed by a court right now over some kind of misdoing, and you say, well, I didn't think any of these are relevant, so I deleted them. See how far you get with that. And that was the first thing. But then there are some others as well, because you have Christopher Steele and some of the records there as well. Then you have the Mueller investigation finding that there were texts between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. And so he gives you paragraph after paragraph of examples of the deletion of evidence. That's number one. Number two, he puts this in the broad category of doctoring, altering, or falsifying documents, because we now know that many of those documents were in one way falsified or altered. And again, this goes on for a page or two, so I won't go into all of those, but you can begin to see that there is, as you read through this, lots of evidence as well of individuals that have worked for either the FBI or broadly in the Department of Justice or the CIA, depends on which group you're looking at, which in one way or another were guilty of doctoring, altering, or falsifying documents. And that one goes on for quite some time. And then, by the way, you might add one additional one that's now just come to light, that 15 minutes before candidate Donald Trump became President Donald Trump, before he took the oath of office, you have the outgoing National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, creating this email that talks about this meeting back in January, which was actually headed up by the president, the vice president, and a number of other people, and arguing that the president told them to do everything by the book. And it strangely looks like a CYA, cover yourself. But nevertheless, go on to the third point. Can't remember, don't know, or lying. And that one goes on literally for pages, because he talks about, Samantha Power, James Clapper, John Brennan, even some things where you had some difficulty with Robert Mueller remembering certain issues, and, of course, Andrew McCabe, not to mention, of course, James Comey. This one goes on for pages of individuals that just can't remember, they don't recall, or in some cases misrepresented information, which once they were put under oath, they said something very differently than what they said on some of the talk shows. And then finally, this is enough, the fourth category is leaking classified documents.
And that, of course, comes from the friend of James Comey who leaked it, and a variety of others. And other illegal leakers were still trying to figure out who leaked information about Michael Flynn, about individuals that knew some things, and a variety of other issues. And so this particular article, which is our second article, goes on for pages, but it, I think, is probably the best summary in less than 10 pages of probably hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of documents and testimony and all the rest. And so if you want to understand why people are saying this really isn't a conspiracy theory, there is a real significant crime there, maybe even one of the greatest scandals of our century. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And we are going to be talking in just a few minutes with Chuck Bentley and his piece that he has written for us, which, again, is the whole issue of Covid Capitalism, time to practice that and to protect lives and livelihoods. So that is on the website, and if you would like to read it. Also, one of the things that we also have is my commentary today. We aren't coming out, and it relates a little bit to some of the things we talked about yesterday with Jerry Tuma. He was giving us one survey that came from CBS. This is a little bit different one, but there are just a lot of individuals who are saying even if you open up the economy, we're not coming out. Even if the restaurants are open, we're not going to the restaurant. Even if airplanes are something you think are safe to fly on, we may not fly on those. So, again, that is a piece that also gives you another survey that was done that sort of reinforces some of the things we talked about yesterday with Jerry Tuma. Well, while we're talking about this whole idea of what has come to be called Obamagate, I was struck by the fact that yesterday Guy Benson quotes from David Harsanyi, and I thought I might quote from him again because he wrote a piece, actually now a week old, saying Obamagate is not a conspiracy theory. And he said, look, it's not a conspiracy theory to note that the investigation into Donald Trump was predicated, he says, on opposition research documents filled with fabulism. Okay, I had to look up fabulism. That's where you take very hypothetical ideas or mystical ideas and put them in as if they actually took place. Okay, fabulism. And most likely Russian disinformation. We know that the Department of Justice withheld contradictory evidence when it began spying on those people associated with Donald Trump. It goes on that we have the proof of the FISA warrant applications, and they were based on fabricated evidence, or in some cases riddled with errors. And so we know that the Obama administration were actually unmasking Trump's allies. We talked a little bit about that yesterday, that now people are saying, oh, that's really common. Oh, it is? Why was it? And if it is, which I don't think that it is, but okay, even if I concede that it shouldn't be, Americans should have more privacy than is allowed. And, of course, then he talks about how the FBI railroaded Michael Flynn into a guilty plea, which almost anybody who's critical of the president or Michael Flynn doesn't ever even at least acknowledge. You know, let's admit that at least there was some heavy-handed attempts to force him to say that he was guilty simply because they threatened to go after his son if they did not. And then he goes on to say that in 2016, the Obama administration's intelligence community had normalized domestic spying. The director of national intelligence, James Clapper, who I mentioned just a minute ago, lied about snooping on American citizens when we know he did. CIA Director John Brennan oversaw an agency that felt comfortable spying on the Senate. We have now evidence of that taking place, with at least 5 of the people underneath him breaking into congressional computer files. So those are facts. They aren't speculation. They aren't conspiracy theories. But again, don't take his word for it. How about the Attorney General? Now, one of the things that Gary Bauer pointed out yesterday in his end-of-day report is a lot of people have focused on what the Attorney General said about the fact that he was not going to put Barack Obama or even Joe Biden under any criminal liability. And that was the news story. But he says what was lost in all that is what the Attorney General, William Barr, did say. So since the mainstream media didn't cover it, and I'm not even sure some of the so-called alternative media covered it, but 3 cheers for Gary Bauer. Here is exactly verbatim what the Attorney General said. He said, what happened to the president in the 2016 election and throughout the first 2 years of his administration was abhorrent. It was a grave injustice, and it was unprecedented in American history. Again, this is the Attorney General of the United States saying this. He went on to say the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus of this country were involved in advancing a false and utterly baseless Russian collusion narrative against the president. He said the proper investigative and prosecutorial standards of the Justice Department were abused in order to reach a particular result. He said we saw 2 standards of justice emerge, one that applied to President Trump and his associates, and the other that applied to everyone else. We cannot allow this ever to happen again. He then goes on to talk about the investigation by John Durham. I've mentioned his name before, but some of you may not know too much about him. But he says the Durham investigation is trying to get to the bottom of what happened, and it will determine whether there were any federal laws that were broken, and if there were, those who broke the laws will be held to account. That's a pretty incredible statement, and while the press focused on the fact that the Attorney General wasn't going to actually have any criminal liability against the former president or vice president, which is very wise, as much as some individuals out there who maybe don't like the previous administration would love to see them in a jumpsuit or frog marched or in handcuffs. We don't want to do that. We didn't do that for Richard Nixon.
He was simply, pardoned, and of course that really obviously affected whether or not Gerald Ford was reelected. And there's no point in putting a president in jail. There's no point in actually subjecting a president to something, unless the one exception was when Bill Clinton lied and was engaged in perjury. Later on, a court, I think it was in Arkansas, removed his law license or something like that. But that's as far as I think anything could ever go in that direction. But everybody focused on that statement. What they should have done is focused on these 4 paragraphs that basically say what happened has never happened before. And given some of the dark chapters in American history, that's quite a statement indeed. And it's never happened with our law enforcement intelligence apparatus. Although I can think of some of the Jim Crow laws and a few things that get pretty close, at least in the states. But again, he's looking at this in terms of the federal government and in terms of the Department of Justice. You might even think about some of the abuses under J. Edgar Hoover and a few others, but still nothing like this before. And so again, that is the statement that didn't get covered, and it's the statement, at least I thought we'd cover here on Point of View. Well, as we come to the close of this hour, I thought I might quote from Pat Sajak. Don't think I've ever quoted from Pat Sajak before. Matter of fact, my wife and I were talking to somebody the other day that the one time we were in Hawaii there, we went over to the little Disney thing, and all of a sudden we see Vanna White and Pat Sajak. They were filming something for, I guess, what's it called, Wheel to Fortune. Anyway, Pat Sajak the other day had this Twitter feed, and since Gary Bauer quoted it, I guess I can quote it as well. But Pat Sajak's Twitter post was this: when a disc jockey or a talk show host or a journalist who is being paid to work from his or her home tells people who can't work, pay bills, or pay their rent or mortgage to stay home and be careful because we're all in this together, it's okay to question the premise. I thought that's a pretty good line. Yeah, that's quite the case, because if nothing else, it is real easy. Some of these people right now, they're saying, we're all in this together. No, I don't think so. I have people in my Sunday school class that have been furloughed, that don't have their jobs. I've got neighbors literally across the street do not have their job. It would be pretty crass for me to say, well, we're all in this together. No, I'm still getting an income. You are still supporting Point of View, and I'm grateful for it. And I don't even begin to understand what it would be like to have lost your job. So anyway, Pat Sajak, I don't think I've ever quoted Pat Sajak on this program, but there's always a first. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about, especially these articles on the fraudulent models and government criminality, those are available on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Chuck Bentley and that article by him, which he wrote for us specifically, Time to Practice COVID Capitalism, Protect Lives and Livelihoods. Think you will really benefit from some of his comments, and then we'll open up the phones to get your thoughts about what he's had to say. Let's take a break, and we'll spend some time with Chuck Bentley right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us for the Wednesday edition of Point of View. As I mentioned yesterday and even in the last hour, we are privileged to have now on the program with us Chuck Bentley, as we're going to talk about a piece that he has written for us called Time to Practice Covid Capitalism, Protect Lives and Livelihoods. We have information about his ministry on the website, but we also have that article. As you well know, he is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries, which is the largest Christian financial ministry in the world, which was originally founded by Larry Burkett. He's the host of the daily radio program My Money Life, and is also the founder and executive director of the Christian Economic Forum, a graduate of Baylor University and a good friend and somebody that we like to call on from time to time as we want to look at issues in the economy from a biblical point of view. So, Chuck Bentley, thank you for joining us today.
Kerby, thank you. It's so good to talk to you. I'm glad that you're doing well, and it's a privilege to talk about the issues that matter, especially with someone as knowledgeable as you. And I think we're going to be able to cover some important topics today.
And I think you and Ann are living in Knoxville. I hope you guys are all safe. And I know you have your children and daughters-in-laws and grandchildren, so I hope everybody's safe in your family.
Yeah, and likewise, Kerby, we all are safe. There's not a single person in the hospital with COVID-19 in all of Knoxville, so we have not been hard hit at all.
That is good, which kind of brings us to the point of your article, and that is, on the one hand, we certainly have to make sure that we keep people safe, but we also need to help people make a livelihood. And you, being in this ministry all these years, have recognized the devastation that can come when people lose their jobs, when there's a great deal of financial stress, when they have to file for bankruptcy. So give us kind of the origin of this article that you wrote for us.
Well, the origin came from the fact that we started getting more and more calls, people who were desperate for help. They were losing their livelihood. They were losing possibly their career, everything they had ever worked for, planned for, prepared for, studied for, and it was just being eradicated. It was going away. And these were people who recognized that the damage being done from the measures to contain the virus were almost as deadly to them as if they had caught the virus. In fact, Kerby, this is an unusual thought for some people. But I've had people call us that would have rather had the virus and fought that and had to fight off the pressure, the stress, the depression, the anger, and the bitterness that they experienced by losing their entire livelihood. Because those two are hand in hand. We do need to save lives, of course. Nobody's arguing against saving lives and being careful and following protocol. But we also have to save livelihoods. And that's what I call COVID capitalism. When people accept the full risk of going back to work, knowing it's dangerous, but they also accept the responsibility to protect not only their lives, but those of the people around them that they're in the office with or the factory with. I think we can do that. And I think it's a much better solution than this binary choice of saying we all have to stay sheltered in and follow draconian measures in order to fight off this virus. I think there's a medium ground, a middle ground that we need to be considering, and considering it right now.
And we need to consider, as you pointed out, the two R's, risks and responsibilities. And we also recognize that life does sometimes have risks. But speak to the other aspect, and you get into this in your second paragraph because you say national, state, and local context should be considered. New York City is obviously different from Sioux City, Iowa. Or let's just use your area there at Knoxville, Tennessee. That's very different than what you found in nursing homes in New York City or in Seattle. So, again, not only the geographical location, but even the location within that particular city or town is oftentimes a very important issue, isn't it?
Well, imagine that we use the same approach to driving. Driving is very dangerous. It's very risky. In fact, the two most at-risk populations are teenage drivers and senior drivers, and yet they still get to drive. There's extra caution around those drivers and extra measures taken to try to help them be successful at driving, yet they get to drive. And we can't imagine a law that came out and said nobody can drive. Nobody can drive. Even though we know specifically where the high-risk areas are, just to blanket a rule to say nobody can now drive, or everybody can drive, but the speed limit is 20. You know, truck drivers have to drive 20. Everybody at every age has to drive 20 miles an hour. Well, we would know how ridiculous that sounds. You have a different speed limit in Texas than they do in downtown San Francisco. And there's a reason for that, because local context matters. And I don't quite understand why our legislators have not been able to get beyond this binary choice. I think they feel the political pressure that this is, if there's too much loss of life, then they will be in trouble. They won't be viewed as compassionate or informed. But if there's too much loss of the economy, they're going to be hurt on the other side. So I think they have to adjust and recognize that Americans will take the risk of going back to work, accompanied with that responsibility. You know, Kerby, I was just thinking, we applaud the frontline healthcare workers, and they have done heroic things. But I think if we give the average American the opportunity to do something heroic, that they will rise to that occasion. You know, if we call them to shared sacrifice, if we call them to do the right thing, I think they will do it. I think that they will rise to the occasion, and we can get out of this dilemma that we find ourselves in.
Well, I need to take a break, but when I come back, I want to talk about what this has done to the economy. But using your car illustration a little bit later in your article, you point out that sometimes we are talking about tremendous damage. You know, if you, for example, as you said, see that you have your safety check light comes on your car, well, then you might pull over, or sometimes you find out it's just a faulty switch. But he says it's one thing to pull over or to take it to a repair shop to check the safety check. It's quite another to pull over, remove the engine, the transmission, the four tires, and then expect it to operate normally again. So, as you said, we've done a safety check. Let's now get the engine running. So let's, if we can, take a break. And when we come back, if you would like to join us, too, Chuck Bentley will be with us a little bit longer. I thought maybe you would like to make a comment or ask a question about this as well. We're talking about this very good piece. It is something you can print out in about 2 pages. I would encourage you, number one, to read it. I would say, number two, you could actually post it on something that you might have. You might have a Facebook page. You might have a Twitter feed. You might have, maybe have your own webpage for that matter, or you might have somebody that you think needs to hear about that. You might want to send it to one of your elected representatives, and so that's why we've posted it there on the website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, we also, of course, have a picture and a bio of Chuck Bentley and a link to crown.org, because there is a great opportunity for you to support that ministry, which I encourage you to do so. I think they have a matching fund right now, and this is an organization we just think very highly of and encourage you to support them as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As various states are loosening stay-at-home orders, we're seeing more and more people in public spaces. But there are a significant number of Americans who aren't coming out anytime soon. The media naturally will focus on the number of people at stores, malls, and parks and probably ignore people staying home. A survey commissioned by Vital Veo concluded that 40% of Americans plan to avoid public spaces unless absolutely necessary long after the coronavirus pandemic has subsided. The survey was of 1,000 U.S. adults and isn't a perfect survey of American attitudes, but does give us a hint to what we might expect over the next few months. Digging down into the survey, you can also discover that about a third will wait a few weeks and a quarter will wait 1 or 2 months. Even more surprising was the fact that some respondents, 16%, said that they were unsure that they would ever feel comfortable out in public again. When I've shared that last statistic, many people have trouble believing it. But think about who that might be in that percentage. It would certainly include people in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. It would likely include people who have a suppressed immune system due to chemotherapy or other factors. It would also include people who already had signs of agoraphobia or paranoid fears. I might also mention that these concerns not only will influence whether some people will feel comfortable in public places, but how they will feel in other people's homes. A majority said that they would be suspicious about their friends' and families' hygiene habits. This might even change our traditions of family reunions and Thanksgiving dinners. The lockdown seems to be changing some of our perceptions about public spaces and even family gatherings. This might be one more example of moving into a new normal. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. If you have a comment or a question, maybe you've been struggling in your own business or struggling with something that has been happening in your community, and you might like to weigh in with our idea of Covid Capitalism, we would love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212 is the on-air line. We're talking for a little bit longer with Chuck Bentley, who is, again, the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. Let me encourage you to go to crown.org. Some great material there. They have a film learning series right now that they're making available for free and a variety of other resources, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But, Chuck, let me just come back for a minute and talk about what is happening to the economy. Because, as you pointed out, you've had individuals that have actually come to you and expressed real concern about the fact that this attempt to keep people safe has destroyed their particular livelihood. And so what are you finding from some of those individuals, and what can we do to maybe turn this around?
Well, let me give an example of just the ripple effects, because we have an interconnected economy. And so when one sector goes down or one sector is hard hit, all of them are hard hit. So the two most common employers in America are retail employers. I think, Walmart has more employees than almost any company in the entire world. So retail and truck driving. Well, when these retail stores are shut down, think about the ripple effect. Number one, the store itself is going to suffer, and then they're going to lay off employees, which we're seeing happen in mass. But think about all the commerce that was happening, delivering those products to those stores that's now cut back, so truck drivers are hurt. And then on the other side of the world, I have a friend who has a company that manufactures garments for the American retail sector. She has employees in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia, 30,000 people who are seamstress. And typically these women are the main breadwinner in their family. They don't make a lot of money, but they're treated well and they're able to feed their families. And right now they're getting 0 orders from their historic customers. And so 30,000 people on the other side of the world are without work. And so then you come back to the retailer itself. They're typically located in a mall. Think about the impact of their ability to pay rent. And now you've got a real estate problem, and you've got a problem with people who have retirement money invested in real estate funds. And so it just continues to ripple, Kerby, and the main culprit is our inability to work. When people go to work, the economy grows. When you interrupt that, all aspects of the economy, including financial support for charities, retirement savings, money available for investment of starting new companies, all of that starts to seize up. And we have been seized now for more than 60 days in our country. And my appeal is to those that are able, whether it's local, state, or federal, to allow the people to go back to work so that they can demonstrate that they will make a heroic effort to save the economy so that we don't have to go in further federal debt to save it and to resuscitate the patient. And they will save their families and also try to protect lives in the meantime. I think we're capable of doing that.
What about this concept that we have some that are essential businesses and others that are not essential? I am broadcasting right now from a county in which there were some real distinctions made between essential businesses and non-essential businesses, but later I will go to my home, which is in a different county, where the county judge said, I think all businesses are essential. What are your thoughts?
I fall into the camp that all businesses are essential. And the reason I do is I think that work is foundational to our well-being. I think it provides us access to all the things that we need to live. We need to work to be able to buy food. We need to work to be able to have a place to live. We need to work to be able to have good mental health. And so when that is interrupted, I understand why it boils over into these protests, because people feel trapped by this. And a lot of times they feel like they're being treated like wards of the state to be managed as opposed to people to be trusted. And I think they're crying out for help to say, I need to get back to work. I need to take care of my family. Please acknowledge that and treat me with some respect and dignity and give me the opportunity to be a hero in this story.
So again, one of the things we have done is posted your article, Time to Practice COVID Capitalism, Protect Lives and Livelihoods. And I would encourage all of you to take the time to print it out, read it, pass it on to some others, maybe post it in some other things. But I wanted, just before we run out of time, Chuck, to go to your website, because right now you are trying to minister and provide hope and resources to as many people as possible through this crisis. And I know that you have a matching challenge. I know that you are certainly encouraging people to get many of the resources that are available on the website. And I would encourage people to donate to you. So talk about what is going on right now at Crown Financial, because in some respects, I think we need you now more than ever.
Well, I think we need God's financial principles now more than ever, for sure, Kerby. I think that one of the takeaways personally that I take from this pandemic is that man's financial principles are built on sand. You know, we're requiring the largest bailout in the history of mankind that I can think of. Multi-trillions. These numbers are truly typically used when you're trying to count stars. You know, the number of stars in the universe, they're astronomical and unsustainable, obviously. And so we need to come back to God's principles. We need to embrace those. We need to really become wise stewards over the wonderful bounty that God has given this country. And I think our unrest and what is so distressing for many is we're seeing just such poor stewardship across the board. And I'm not here to cast stones, but we do need God's principles more than ever. But on a personal level, we recognize that people need to go into a different mindset right now. We've listed the 5 to 7 steps that people need to take. There's a free ebook at our website they can download to begin to set aside money, to save more money, to be prepared for the duration of this, however long it may last. I think that the government tipped their hand a little bit when they extended unemployment benefits to 10.5 months. I believe that was probably the time horizon they were looking at.
Yes.
When they passed that legislation. We've created a free crisis budget training online so that those who've had interrupted income can make an adjustment there. We've also posted a daily update on where the jobs are being created.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, Kirby, there's a lot of new jobs that are already short of people, and they're looking for people to go back to work. And they need help right now. And so we're posting those online. We're also posting tools and resources to help couples. I read recently that, and we've had people calling us about this, that their marriage is under stress.
Yes.
I don't know about you, Kirby, but I've worked from home longer than any other period in my 42 years of marriage. It's been an adjustment both ways for both of us. And that there's some couples that aren't adjusting well to that, and we've got a program called Money Dates.
Very good.
And even if you don't go out and eat, there are 10 steps to work through the key financial issues just privately between you and your spouse. It tells you what to do before the date, how to get prepared for the date, what to talk about while you're on that date, and then some follow-up when it's over. And we have tested that a number of times. And couples are saying it has been a fantastic use of their time, far better than watching everything they want to see on Netflix. If they'll just set aside the entertainment for now and do something that helps them get prepared for when we do come out of this. If you'll make the investment today, you'll reap the reward tomorrow. And so we've tried to make all the resources we can available for free to help people during this time. And we're excited about the impact we have been able to have, Kirby. And I appreciate you mentioning that we need financial support, but I just want to remind those who hear you day in and day out that you guys constantly stand in the gap. And it's such an important gap. And I've known your ministry for so many years, and I always tell people why we personally choose to support it. And that is, I think you're accomplishing something so vital to this culture right now, which is upholding religious freedom. It's upholding a biblical Christian worldview, and it's really fighting the fight in the trenches, helping the next generation be prepared to stand for liberty. And when I write about COVID capitalism, it wouldn't even be possible without people like you to stand up and to be able to articulate that. So thank you, Kerby.
Well, thank you for being with us. Again, you can go to crown.org and find all that great material from Chuck Bentley, and I do encourage you to support them and get access to so many of the great resources they have. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after these important messages.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I'd love to know your thoughts about opening up the economy, maybe even how you've dealt with this right now. And again, let me commend to you, first of all, the great material at crown.org. Chuck Bentley with us, as he has now had to head on to some of the other activities that he has, but was willing to give us about a half an hour. So that gives you a chance if you'd like to weigh in with your comments, 1-800-351-1212. In addition to their material, one of the articles, actually it's a new booklet coming out, and I may be jumping the gun because we haven't mailed them yet, but you can be looking for those if you are a donor. I've written this piece on a biblical view on money management. Of course, some of the material that is in that you have perhaps heard us talk about over the years here on Point of View, but again, we have a biblical view of money, and then we also talk about a biblical view of giving, and then a biblical view of debt and savings. And so it's just an attempt to try to summarize some of the things we've talked about so often here on Point of View. And then, as I always do in each one of these booklets that we make available, I'll recommend resources. And some of those would be things like Crown Financial, or even Larry Burkett, the original founder of Christian Financial Concepts on how to manage your money. Jay Richards, Money, Greed, and God. Randy Alcorn, of course, Money, Possessions, and Eternity. And then, if I could, mention a few of my books, Christians and Economics and Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times. So this was an attempt to address that issue as well. Some of my more recent booklets are just trying to address those issues. The one recently on loneliness and lockdowns is a very important issue. This one, managing your money during a crisis. So those are some key issues. But one of the things that Chuck Bentley was talking about is the need for us to come out, and you will see that my commentary today is entitled, We Aren't Coming Out, because a number of people say, unless I can feel safe going into your business, I'm not. And so there are a number of people that say they may wait a while. You can open up the economy again, but I may not be going. And so this gets back to a reality that we have to resolve the tension between a lockdown and liberty. And Conrad Black, I quoted him the other day, helps us understand that the original purpose of flattening the curve was to make sure that we did not overwhelm the healthcare system. And I think we can say that we've been effective in that regard. But if you then move the goalpost, as some people have started doing that, and saying flatten the curve now means we can't come out till we have a vaccine, as Conrad Black points out, viruses do not die. They only become dormant, and there's no possibility of stamping out the coronavirus completely now that it has entered our country. And that is really true. Now, are we going to get some vaccines? Yes, maybe. We'll see about that. We've seen some success. I might just point out that Dr. Merrill Matthews has written a piece on can the government force you to be vaccinated? So we'll be talking about that on Friday when he's with us. You can read ahead because he's posted that in the Hill, and it was one of the articles featured on the Drudge Report, so it's pretty easy to find. But again, the point that Conrad Black is making is that we've reached, in many cases, the crest. There are some places where it's broken out a little bit here or there, but that is the case. And so he is concerned that in some respects there's really an attempt to sort of keep this going, redefine the goal from flattening the curve to the elimination of the coronavirus, which will never happen, by the way, to simply try to hurt whether it's the president, and that would be Donald Trump, or just have an impact in some of these senatorial races and get enough Democrats to actually begin to take over the U.S. Senate. So we'll see where that goes. But again, he goes with these statistics that remind us that we may be a lot safer than we realize, because he says if you are talking about an individual under the age of 20, there is virtually no one. I mean, the numbers are so high, it's hard to even give you a good estimate. If you talk about people in their 20s, then the death rate is 1 in 25,000. And by the way, I think these numbers may be low in some sense because we, as we do more testing, find out more people actually have had the virus. And
were asymptomatic. But we'll take these numbers: 1 in 25,000. In their 30s, 1 in 14,000. In their 40s, 1 in 7,000, and on up. So you can kind of see that in some respects, if you are under the age of 50, certainly under the age of 60, and you have no significant other health issues, you are going to be pretty safe indeed. And so this is just a reminder that we may be able to really begin to reintegrate our society. If you say, well, then how do we reopen America? Well, tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Charmaine Yost. This article by Paul Winfrey and Charmaine Yost came out a couple of days ago, in which they listed 12 actions to reopen America. There are actually 179 reactions. I think we've got Charmaine on for about a half an hour, if I remember right. And so we're not going to cover all 179 there. But again, to allow businesses in counties where there is a low incidence of COVID-19 to reopen. And a reminder that just 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Illinois, and California, account for more than half of all the cases and more than 60% of all the deaths. And then if you then focus on those places even there where a lot of those take place, which tend to be, as we know, nursing homes and assisted care facilities, you can begin to see what we can do. And then to use stay-at-home orders sparingly, establish a national portal, which we'll talk about with her tomorrow in terms of some of the data, and to allow medical offices to open, because by shutting those down, we also are hurting many other people that are healthy but aren't getting the cancer screenings, not getting colonoscopies, not getting mammograms, not getting biopsies, or individuals who in one way or another maybe have some health issues but are afraid to go to the hospital, but might go to a doctor's office or a clinic to begin to address some of those issues as well. And then they also talk about liability protections for a safe harbor for businesses. And if you are actually receiving my daily commentaries, you know that I talked about that and also have written about that as well. And just a variety of other issues that we'll be talking about with Charmaine Yost tomorrow. So those are some things to help us think about once we begin to open up the economy. How can we do it safely and protect lives, but also protect livelihoods? Let's get to my first article here today, and it's entitled Fraudulent Models, Fatal Consequences, and it is by Julie Kelly, in which she spends some time, first of all, reminding us that the model that scared everybody was the one out of the London-based Imperial College, and the person who really kind of coined the term, if you will, and made it a household name, if nothing else, is Dr. Neil Ferguson, who, when they first said, if we don't do any kind of very draconian action, 2.2 million Americans would die, 80% of Americans would be infected. And so as a result, then modified it by saying, if we can do social distancing, quarantining, all the rest, then maybe we can reduce those numbers. And of course, Dr. Deborah Birx referred to that model. Certainly Dr. Anthony Fauci referred to that model, and all the rest. And the model originally said, we'll just have to keep these harsh rules in place for 18 months until a vaccine is found. Well, of course, we know what happened there. And then this one goes on to talk about another model that very quickly people began to cite instead, and that was the model that came out of the University of Washington area. In particular, it's called the Murray model, and it was by Dr. Christopher Murray, who is the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle. And that produced a lot of those graphs that you might remember, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx pointing to, even the president and many others. But as you look at this, and if you read through this article, you can see that there have been so many questions about the original model, the Ferguson model, that had what was called buggy computer code that was more than a decade old. And one software engineer said all papers based on this code should be retracted immediately. Imperial College's modeling efforts should be reset with a new team that isn't under Professor Ferguson, who, by the way, is now resigned. And then when you look at the Murray model, again, you can see that it has been revised, 16 times. And so how accurate was that? So these two models, one from London and the other from the Seattle area, are the reason we've locked down, and now we recognize that these models were not accurate. And Julie Kelly begins to tell you that there's pretty good evidence that maybe not only were they inaccurate, they were fraudulent, and they perpetuated on us a lockdown that maybe should never have been done in this way. So if you'd like to read that article, it's on our website, pointofview.net. I encourage you to read it and maybe post it and get some comments from some of your friends and neighbors and others who are convinced that we still need to keep the economy locked down tightly. You look at those models, you say, there's been a lot of revision since then. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I want to get into our second article we've posted in just a minute. But let me just, as a program note, mention that next hour we're going to be talking with Ryan and Selena Frederick about their book, See Through Marriage, because their argument is that married couples should be more than roommates. They need to be able to know each other and to love each other deeply. And so they're going to be talking about this issue of transparency. And this will be appropriate in light of even the comment just made in
passing by Chuck Bentley of being at home with his wife. Sometimes that creates some tension in a marriage that didn't used to exist. But even if you're not married, there's a whole chapter here about the danger of isolation and the lies of isolation. And so whether you're talking about being isolated because we're locked down, or whether you talk about isolation in a marriage, something I talk about in my most recent booklet, Crowded Loneliness. We can have people that are lonely by themselves when they're living alone. There's also crowded loneliness and living together loneliness. And so in some respects, I thought that this would be a book that might be very apropos for what many of us are going through right now. And just, again, opportunity for any of us that are married to get maybe a 10,000-mile wheel alignment and to learn a little bit more about some of the things they have to share. So that's coming up in the next hour. And as I've already alluded to, tomorrow we're going to be talking about all sorts of very important issues in terms of how to really bring this economy back. Also going to be talking with our good friend Dr. Tim McGrew and also Dr. Doug Groteis. If you are not familiar, there are some of these Christian colleges that are starting to say we're really struggling financially, so we'll just get rid of our philosophy department. Well, the philosophy department is where, first of all, you talk about how to develop a Christian world and life view, which I think is what you'd really want to do in a Christian university. And most of the philosophy department are where people do apologetics. And don't you think that Christianity's been under attack like ever before? So I'm going to talk to two individuals, both who teach philosophy, both who are outstanding apologists. Maybe before any other universities think about disbanding their philosophy department, maybe they might want to think twice about that. So that'll be a conversation we'll have tomorrow as well. Friday's our weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us. He's got two different articles out right now that we'll be talking about. Benedexter, of course, is also going to be here, and we'll have her viewpoints commentary, as well as looking at all sorts of issues in the news. So I think you will appreciate that as well. Well, if you look at the United States Senate right now, tempers are flaring, tensions are flaring, in large part because you have a couple of Republicans who are going to investigate some things. One of those is Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, in the judiciary, who wants to call on a number of officials that were in the Obama administration to testify about the FISA court application, how the Crossfire Hurricane investigation went off the rails, and that has been criticized, as you might imagine, by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Then you also have Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican from Wisconsin, and Chuck Grassley, who in the Homeland Security Committee also want to investigate, in this particular case, Hunter Biden and what was happening in Ukraine and a variety of others. And, of course, this has created a great deal of tension back and forth. Democrats suggesting maybe they won't even go to some of these committee meetings, but nevertheless, I think there's going to be an ongoing investigation. And the argument that why is this being done right now? Well, maybe it's for elections, but you know, if I think about it, Lindsey Graham right now is in kind of a contested situation. He may not be reelected. So the better way to have just avoided the controversy is just simply not to even called for this investigation. Ron Johnson and Chuck Grassley, they're not running for reelection right now, so you can't say they would benefit. Now, maybe they could argue it's benefiting Donald Trump, but I think the real issue is we have all these documents that have now dropped. And now we know a little bit more than we knew even a few weeks ago because of the investigations that have been carried on by the Attorney General. And more importantly, just an understanding that some of the investigation that has even gone into the issue of Michael Flynn has now resulted in all sorts of documents. But if you have trouble trying to sort all this out, there are all sorts of comments. There are all sorts of charges and countercharges. I thought a very good piece, which is our second article, is by Victor Davis Hanson. And if you want to print it out, make sure you got some some paper, I should say, in your printer, because what you're going to have to do is print out a number of pages. But I think this was a really good job that really tried to distill, you know, it could be hundreds of pages, maybe even thousands of pages of lots of documents. And so, if nothing else, illustrates why the FBI and the Department of Justice and the CIA are under some kind of microscope right now, and also explaining in large part why the Attorney General, Bill Barr, and his investigator, John Durham, are investigating this. And so I would say that if you're just trying to make sense of all of this, he takes really what has happened over the last 4 years and puts them into 4 rough categories. Number 1, deletion of evidence. You have, of course, everything from the one that most people know about, the decision by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to delete 33,000 of her emails, claiming they were private and not work-related. Imagine if you're being investigated and you say, look, I just wanted to help you out. I just deleted all of these emails because I don't think any of them are pertain to your investigation. Can you imagine the reaction to that? But then he also talks about Christopher Steele and some of those issues, also Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and the phones of Strzok and Page that were wiped clean. And that is just a whole section that he covers in terms of deletion of evidence. Number 2, this one goes on for quite a while, doctoring documents, altering documents, falsifying documents, and again, finding information that was in one way or another withheld or falsified or manipulated in one way or another. And so that involves the FBI, the CIA, and a variety of others, and even includes, interestingly, something that just has dropped recently, that about 15 minutes before Donald Trump took office, the oath of office, the outgoing National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, wrote this kind of strange email trying to reconstruct what took place in a meeting in the West Wing on January 5th with the president, the vice president, a variety of other individuals, arguing that the president told us to do everything by the book. And it just almost looks like a cover your you-know-what kind of email. And that one has been in the news lately. Number 3, I can't remember, I don't know, or I'll actually lie. And this one gets into all sorts of investigation. You got Samantha Power, you got James Clapper, you've got John Brennan, you've got even some of the situations in which Robert Mueller couldn't answer questions. You got James Comey, you got Andrew McCabe. The list just goes on for pages of examples that all fit under the category of, what does he call it? Can't remember, don't know, or lying. And then the last one, leaking documents. Of course, we have James Comey leaking a document through his friend to the media. You have all sorts of illegal leaks that have taken place that people are still trying to investigate. And that may be what some of the investigation that might be happening by Lindsey Graham will take place. And so if nothing else, as I said, make sure you got enough pieces of paper in your printer, because I don't know if it's 10 pages, but it's quite lengthy. But again, even though it's lengthy, it's probably the best summary of the many years, really, that this investigation has taken place. And it's all under the title, The Arts of Government Criminality. And I think illustrates only so well, this is not a conspiracy. It's not a hoax. There's just a lot of very concerning issues. And, of course, once that report that comes out from John Durham, I will probably know a lot more. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to talk about transparency, a see-through marriage, and how to make your marriage or your life much better. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about your marriage, but whether you're married or not, I think you're going to benefit from this idea of transparency. And even one of the chapters deals with this issue of isolation. And we have seen that people can not only be isolated because they're living alone, but they can be isolated in a marriage. Matter of fact, my most recent booklet here deals with loneliness, crowded loneliness, living together loneliness, and so much more. So I think you're going to benefit from this book, See Through Marriage, which just came out earlier this month, experiencing the freedom and joy of being fully known and fully loved. And if you think about this, married couples really need to be more than roommates. They should know each other intimately, and transparency is really an important issue. So we're going to focus some time and attention on that this hour. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, we also point you to the website fiercemarriage.com. And Ryan and Selena Frederick actually created fiercemarriage.com back in 2013 when they really felt that God might be calling them to share with very significant transparency some of the struggles that they have had. We have lots of great information about them, and they have a great social media presence. So Ryan and Selena, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Here, Blake. Just Blake.
Yes, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
We were here.
Well, I think we're having problems with the connection here, so we'll see if we can make that work, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And again, the book is entitled See Through Marriage, and they kind of walk through some of the spiritual, physical, and psychological health that leads to, if you will, the flourishing in marriage. And of course, as we have talked about so often, this whole idea of transparency can sometimes be pretty scary. And if nothing else, we'll spend some time talking with them and giving you some perspective on those issues, and we'll reconnect with them in just a minute. While we're doing so, let me mention that the last hour we had a chance to talk with Chuck Bentley, and that material on the time to practice COVID capitalism is still available on the website. And then, of course, my Viewpoints commentary today is We Aren't Coming Out. And a reason I wrote that is because even as we're going to, especially tomorrow, talk about what can be done to get the economy back in functioning order, we really need to address the bigger issue, and that is even if you open up the economy, even if you open up the stores, the malls, and the parks, is it possible people would still stay home? So one of the reasons I spent some time writing about that is that at least one survey showed that about 40% of Americans said they might avoid some of those public places. And so that is one of the reasons we've posted that. And one of the most arresting statistics that I found is that about 16% said that they were unsure if they would ever feel comfortable out in public again. So we have all those resources available on our website, pointofview.net. And let's see if we can now connect up with Ryan and Selena Frederick. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for letting us come on.
Yeah, good to be here.
Let's, if maybe either one of you or both of you tell the story that led to this. That takes us back to even before 2013, in which you were struggling with some marriage issues, and as a result began to understand that transparency is the only way you were going to get the marriage to work.
Yeah, this book was it was really birthed out of a theme that we've seen in people that write in and call into our podcast or write into us on the blog or social media. Transparency is one of the biggest felt needs that we're seeing. And I think in our podcast, we tend to be pretty transparent and I think forthcoming with our own lives and our own marriage. And so people really just writing in, just kind of wondering, hey, how do we do that and why? And so we actually took that kind of theme that we experienced from our readers and our listeners and pitched the book to our publisher, and they got right on board. So what we have now in See Through Marriage is the output of all the years of just kind of hearing from other marriages, but also living that way ourselves.
I might just mention that there's, about 15 chapters, I should say, and about 200 pages. And then each section has a study for questions and study and discussion, those kinds of things. So certainly a couple could go through this individually, but it does seem to me, Ryan, that what we're talking about here is something that could be used in a small group Bible study. Is that possible?
Yeah, that was one of our big hopes for this book, is that pastors or family marriage pastors or even just small group leaders would find this to be a useful resource. In Christian culture in America and just in Western Christian culture, small groups are not rare, but I think small groups or Bible studies that really lend themselves to true, transparent, gospel-centered living, I think those are exceedingly rare. And so it's one of our hopes that married couples will see the value of transparency in their own marriage, but also see the value of just utter, complete transparency with others in Christian community. So, that is one of our hopes, is that this would be a useful tool for couples and small group leaders alike.
Selena, let me come to you because, the opening chapter is a case for transparency, and a lot of people think, especially right now during this lockdown, look, I just got to make peace. Matter of fact, my guest the last hour just mentioned the fact that I've been working at home longer than I ever had before, and the implication is it's kind of been a strain on the marriage, although I've known him and I know they've had a great situation, but there are probably some people saying, look, we're just locked down here every single day. I dare not get into this issue transparency because it might become thermonuclear pretty quickly. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that there's definitely that potential, and there's definitely, I can't say we have never engaged in that during this time because, everybody feels it in different ways at different moments. And so I think we just have to have some extended grace for each other in when it comes to that. But I think dealing with transparency, if you have this idea of dealing with some of the root issues in your marriage, right? Like we can get mad at each other for chores and, different small day-to-day things. But if it's a real theme, there's something that's kind of underlying maybe how we're communicating to each other. Maybe there's some things we need to talk about and not just say, hey, I'm just struggling with this, but I don't know what to do. I'm struggling with this. Can you help me walk through this with me? Because I feel like I'm walking in the dark here. Or, and it's hard because when we have to bring those conversations up to somebody, it's usually how we feel about them, right? Or the feelings that we're frustrated with our spouse. And why are we frustrated? Because they make us mad, right? It's their fault all the time. But Christ, in 1 John 1, 6-8, we're told to have fellowship with the light, right? And to walk in the light as he is in the light. And when we have fellowship with one another and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin, we say, and if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So if we're kind of just living this way and thinking that things are okay and we're not addressing some of the big things in our life that are creating kind of that darkness and tension, then I would question if we're really, walking in the light as Christ has called us to.
Yes. And again, that's one of the chapters here, Why Live in the Light. But when we come back from the break, let's, if we can, talk about the difference between false vulnerability and meaningful risk. One of the individuals we love to interview on a regular basis is Andy Crouch. He wrote a book called Strong and Weak. And sometimes we think we're being vulnerable, but it really isn't the case. So we'll talk about that as we continue our conversation with Ryan and Selena Frederick right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As various states are loosening stay-at-home orders, we're seeing more and more people in public spaces. But there are a significant number of Americans who aren't coming out anytime soon. The media naturally will focus on the number of people at stores, malls, and parks and probably ignore people staying home. A survey commissioned by Vital VO concluded that 40% of Americans plan to avoid public spaces unless absolutely necessary long after the coronavirus pandemic has subsided. The survey was of 1,000 U.S. adults and isn't a perfect survey of American attitudes, but does give us a hint to what we might expect over the next few months. Digging down into the survey, you can also discover that about a third will wait a few weeks and a quarter will wait 1 or 2 months. Even more surprising was the fact that some respondents, 16%, said that they were unsure that they would ever feel comfortable out in public again. When I've shared that last statistic, many people have trouble believing it. But think about who that might be in that percentage. It would certainly include people in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. It would likely include people who have a suppressed immune system due to chemotherapy or other factors. It would also include people who already had signs of agoraphobia or paranoid fears. I might also mention that these concerns not only will influence whether some people will feel comfortable in public places, but how they will feel in other people's homes. A majority said that they would be suspicious about their friends and families' hygiene habits. This might even change our traditions of family reunions and Thanksgiving dinners. The lockdown seems to be changing some of our perceptions about public spaces and even family gatherings. This might be one more example of moving into a new normal. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The new book that just came out this month, See Through Marriage, Experiencing the Freedom and Joy of Being Fully Known and Fully Loved, published by our friends at Baker Books, and about 15 pages, great material, questions at the end of each chapter that you can use for your discussion. But let me, if I can, maybe come to you, Ryan, for just a minute and talk about the difference between false vulnerability and meaningful risk, because that's important. Sometimes people sound like they're vulnerable, but it isn't the case. And when you're talking about this idea of transparency, it's important to get it right, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And in the book, and really on our blog and stuff, we try to really differentiate between kind of this fashionable vulnerability or fashionable authenticity and true vulnerability, true authenticity. And Andy Crouch, as you mentioned in his book, he introduced this idea of meaningful risk. And what meaningful risk is, it's really this willingness to be exposed in a way that actually threatens, it actually threatens your own sense of identity. And what I mean by that is it's not a bad threatening, right? Our identity is secure in Christ, but meaningful risk does give someone the permission to really speak into our lives in a way that does change how we view and how we view things and how we act. Just as one example, like I'm thinking in a small group setting, a false vulnerability would say something like, we have struggles just like every couple, right? So that feels like you're being vulnerable and you're being honest, but there's not really any vulnerability there. But the meaningful risk side would be more along the lines of we've been fighting almost daily because,
yes.
And then you say the reasons you're fighting. So there's a difference there, and it's vital to true transparency.
Very well said. Selena, let me come to you because you mentioned just a minute ago this idea of living in the light. And, of course, we see this in 1 John chapter 1. Talk about what that means and how maybe that's even helped you in your own marriage.
Yeah, I mean, in the verse, it really talks, it's really an action. It's a verb, right? So to be walking in the light, to be living in the light. We're not standing, we're not sitting, we're not just being, but we are living our life in a way that is, it's bringing glory to God, which requires us to be honest. And, for us, we live our lives, in a way that is kind of visually speaking, like open doors, open windows, lights on. There's nothing that is really hidden between Ryan and I. And there's a difference, between privacy and secrecy, which we also talk about in the book. And I think privacy is more kind of that small group thing like we talked about. But anyways, just being together, walking in the light, being known by each other, it's a hard thing to do. And we've struggled with it for sure.
Well, so we can maybe get into isolation, because one of your chapters is the lies of isolation. And I sort of alluded to that when I started this by saying, some people say, look, I can't be transparent because I'm just trying to keep the peace right now. You have no idea what I'm trying to deal with in terms of the lockdown or just any kind of circumstance. In other words, I need time alone so that I can work on myself, or my marriage isn't that bad. It's definitely not as bad as other people's. And both of you have probably run into that over the years in terms of not only before you wrote the book, the blog, but even in some of the marriage counseling and conversations you've had with other couples, haven't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, each one of these lies, I'm glad you brought that up, because each one of these lies of isolation, they are kind of built on just some sort of false premise. Usually the false premise goes all the way down to where your identity is coming from, what the purpose of your marriage even is, and what you believe in. It even goes back to the garden. One of the examples that just hit me so hard it's not really an example. It's a connection that was made in Scripture. And you see Adam and Eve, right, in Genesis chapter 3, where the fall happens. What do? As soon as that shame hits, they run and hide. They run and hide in the trees, so to speak. And then we see a picture of God walking to the garden saying, where are you? What have you done, basically? Kind of asking those probing questions. And so what they were trying to do is they were running and hiding in their shame, and what they found was that it didn't hide them. It didn't actually cover them. It didn't actually fix the shame they were feeling. But we, as people on this side of the cross, when we feel our shame, we tend to do the same thing. We run and hide. The difference is, where do we run and hide to? And the beauty of the cross is, and the beauty of the gospel is that we can also go run and hide behind a tree, but this time the tree is the cross of Jesus Christ, and we can be confident in knowing that he is covering our shame, covering our sin, and not in a way that just sweeps it under the rug, but in a way that actually deals with the heart issues that underlie it. So each one of these lies really is believing. Each one of these, there's an underlying premise that I am the way that my shame is covered or hidden, and the gospel completely diffuses those lies.
Again, you talk about life unhidden in the pre-fall world, but we live in the fallen world. And maybe, Selena, that gets us into, why is it that we still hide? And maybe it's fear, maybe it's shame, maybe it's exposure. Whatever it might be, it does seem to me that there are a lot of reasons that people listening to this broadcast right now, couples that you've perhaps had a chance to interact with over the years through your blog and through your website, are just simply saying, I don't know, this is pretty risky to begin to actually expose myself to somebody who might reject me or might make fun of me or whatever it might be. So as you have interacted with individuals, what are some of the barriers that keep them from actually being transparent like you talk about in the book?
Yeah, I think you hit most of the big ones of fear and shame. Fear is very gripping. It's very isolating. It's very, it can just keep us trapped, I think, and enslaved to our sin, as well as shame. But the beauty of, what Ryan was saying of just like the gospel and the cross is, and pride. Pride is another big one. At least that's probably been in my life, right? It's easy to hide behind, I got this. It's fine. I've got this. And we can hide behind all of our social media, anything like that, because everybody else has their life together, right? It appears like nobody else struggles with this stuff. And it's hard to bring that up because we don't believe that there is redemption on the other side. We may not believe that God is into restoring our hearts, to bringing deeper joy into our marriage, to bringing hope and life in areas that maybe we don't even see right now. So I guess seeing that promise on the other side of this hard road of facing, being transparent, right? Being honest with our spouse about certain areas. There's a promise in that. And I think we have to take hold of God's truth and take him at his word and remember that, there might be some rejection at the time. There might be some hurt feelings. There might be some things being broken down, but that's only to bring sanctification and redemption and restoration ultimately.
One of the things that I would have to say, Ryan, is that maybe women are better at being vulnerable. There is a sense in which women generally, and these are always open to exceptions, but women generally tend to have better relationship skills. If you go to almost any church, the women's ministry is thriving. They form what I call the steel magnolia relationships almost immediately. The men's ministry sometimes is flourishing, but usually is not. Men are a lot more quiet. Men are less likely to share their feelings. So part of this transparency issue really is something that men have to work at, perhaps even more than women. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Of course, there's truth, right, to those kind of generalities and stereotypes for a reason, because they are generally true. I think a lot of that is cultural more than it is. I would be more quick to attribute that to cultural issues than just maybe biological or psychological issues within men or women. What I mean by that is we, now in the 2020 here, we're living in the shadow of globalization, in the shadow of industrialization, and the sexual revolution, and all these things that happened back in the early 1900s, all the way through the 60s and 70s, and everything that did to kind of the psyche of men and the psyche of women. I think, they do lend themselves to the idea that men are less likely to open up. With that said, the research shows that men, although they may be a little bit tougher to get into, the emotions are just as deep, right? And they feel just as deeply. And so, the challenge is getting them to recognize that, getting them to recognize the need. We actually go to great lengths in the book to explain the fact that it is a good thing to understand your psychological self. It is a biblical mandate in some verses. It's a good thing. It's also a necessary thing. And then the third thing is that you actually can change how you feel about things. You can grow in emotional maturity and emotional resiliency and emotional intelligence. Those are things that you can gain as a skill. So I spend a lot of time encouraging men and women alike to go down that road.
Well, when we take a break, we'll come back and talk about that, because the first 4 chapters kind of set the context, and the next chapters get into the see-through self, the physiological and psychological self, and how transparency leads to oneness. So we'll talk about some of those aspects. And again, if you just happen to join us, the book is entitled See Through Marriage. It's published by Baker Books. It just came out this month, Experiencing the Freedom and Joy of Being Fully Known and Fully Loved. And you can also go to the website pointofview.net, which will link you easily to fiercemarriage.com, which you can go to as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Ryan and Selena Frederick right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Ryan and Selena Frederick. The book is entitled See Through Marriage. And the middle section of the book really talks about your see-through self, why knowing your spiritual self matters, your physiological self, your psychological self. And I wanted to focus on this idea of know thyself for a little bit before we get into how this is going to help in a particular marriage. So, Ryan, help us out, because in some respects, people which already have been thinking about transparency and how that fits need to also do a little bit of self-evaluation, don't they?
Yeah. It's a lot can be said for just kind of knowing how God has wired you as a human being. Just in general, that's the physiological piece. We have limits. We're not God. He is. I think John Piper, he has a quote. It said, every night going to sleep is basically a daily reminder that God is God and we are not. Right? So we have limits. I was reading up on some business leader, multi-billion-dollar business, probably like I think it was either Amazon or Apple or somebody like that, one of those companies. And one of the leaders in one of those companies said, every bad decision I've ever made was the result of having too little sleep. And so a lot can be said about knowing yourself physiologically. And those same physiological forces play into our marriages in many ways, but also psychologically. Knowing how you're wired as an emotional person, as a thinking person, what it means to be self-aware and know how you desire to be loved and how you communicate your tendencies, your habits. All those things are obviously very powerful bits of knowledge that I think as faithful Christians can spend time learning about and growing in for the sake of a healthier marriage and a more God-glorifying marriage.
One of the sections it says there is, how does this play out in your marriage? Because you talk about your physiological self and your psychological self. There is a sense in which if you understand what your gifts are on the positive sense, or what your temptations or your failures are, that helps you, because your emotional maturity, your physical limitations are going to really play out in a marriage. And I've heard many a person say, I used to think that I was one person until I got married. Then I realized I was probably a little more selfish and a whole lot more limited than I probably would have ever imagined once I actually was in a relationship like that.
Yeah, I mean, marriage has a way of kind of distilling out of us the true essence of who we are. Just like when you squeeze a piece of fruit, what's really in it comes out, right? Hopefully that's good juice and not rotten. But so knowing that stuff kind of proactively, I think, is always going to be a good tool in any married person's arsenal.
Well, again, that's the middle section of the book, which I think is really a good self-analysis. But then in the time remaining, I wanted to kind of work our way through some of the other chapters. Maybe I'll go to Selena this time just to see if maybe you can address this issue of oneness, because we're talking about transparency. We're talking about knowing yourself. But quite frankly, I think there's probably a few people listening right now that say, I want oneness in marriage, and I'm not going to get that through transparency. So help them understand why that really is a false idea.
Yeah. If we're living kind of individually in our marriage and we're kind of operating on ourselves, depending on ourselves, trying to just do everything ourselves, we're really not living out the covenant, I think, the way God designed and purposed it for. By living transparently and knowing each other, there's a deeper unity that can be experienced, and that deeper unity brings, I feel like, more glory to the Lord. And it's not an easy thing, and it's not something that is popular by any means. But again, secrecy. When you have secrecy in your marriage, it's going to cause division. When I'm hiding things or hiding myself in some ways, there's going to be division, and then we're always going to feel that division in the ways of how we experience love. Like, we can't be fully loved if we're not fully known, right? And so if there's always something that we're hiding or holding back, the unity is always going to be on the chopping block, so to speak.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about, while we're talking about oneness here, the idea of guarding your hearts. And of course, that has a reality for Ryan because you had heart surgery in Switzerland, but the heart and the, if you will, the biblical sense, but also how words and deeds can also lead to oneness, because that's really important as well. And the idea of really kind of cultivating some kind of intimacy in your marriage, you guard your hearts, and at the same time, through words and deeds, begin to develop intimacy. Talk about what that looks like.
It's funny you mentioned Switzerland and having heart surgery over there, because one of the clearest analogies that I can think of is having post-op, they had left wires that were kind of strung up and over my rib cage. It's kind of gruesome, but strung into my skin, up and over my rib cage, and then down and touching strategic parts of my heart. And the reason why they left those wires in place was just in case, my heart decided to go haywire, they could quickly, zap me, right, with a cardioversion machine.
Right.
And I think the spouse, the words that you say to your wife or to your husband are like those wires. They're a direct line to your spouse's heart, and they can either bring life or they can bring death, depending on the nature of what you're saying and how you're saying it. And so, I think being aware of how your words affect each other is critical. But in the same way, like you said, we guard our hearts. We're called in Scripture to guard our hearts, for it is the wellspring of life. That's not applying to a marital covenant in this sense, right? It's guarding our hearts from our sinful tendencies, knowing that the heart is deceitful, and knowing that we need to guard our hearts in a way that is walking with the Spirit, not walking in the flesh. I think there's a distinction to be made there, but that process, guarding but also letting your spouse in, those simultaneous activities are crucial for our sanctification, but also for our oneness and closeness in marriage.
We're talking about the book See Through Marriage, Experiencing the Freedom and Joy of Being Fully Known and Fully Loved. Let's, if we can, then get into some of the other application chapters, one on cultivating a see-through sex life, and the other is the idea of cultivating and really mastering a see-through communication. Let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about the idea of a sex life, because when we talk about intimacy, one of the things that makes a marriage relationship different than, say, a friendship is you can be as close as you can to a buddy, but that's not the same as the sexual intimacy that takes place in marriage and the idea of becoming one flesh. What can we learn in terms of transparency and intimacy there?
Well, in the Bible, we see a pretty clear picture of what healthy sex can be, or what it should be. And but so often we have distorted views, right? We don't always see sex through the biblical lens. We see them through a worldly lens. We see them through our fleshly lens. And so I think the first step in being transparent is communicating our expectations, but also doing so with meaningful risk involved, meaning that recognizing, coming to the table saying, I have some expectations about sex that are probably good and healthy, and I probably have expectations that are not good, not healthy. So let's have a conversation around that, and letting the Bible be our authority, not just my own heart, my own desires, or my spouse's heart, her desires, and really letting that bear weight. And that lets us both come to the table with kind of we're kind of disarmed, in that we're letting God's word speak authority over that area. So there's a prescription how sex can be in Scripture, but then also there's descriptions, right, of what it can look like when we are submitting ourselves to these biblical ideals, and all the particulars, right? You can get into, okay, what should the experience be like? How can we get a steamier, quote unquote, sex life? All the things that a couple might want. I strongly believe that those things, in many cases, are right and good, but can only be explored by that couple on the premise of being fully loved in this area based on what Scripture has to say.
Let's, if we can, take a break. And as we do so, let me encourage you to go to the website, fiercemarriage.com. First of all, you can find out more about the book and get a copy of it there if you'd like. It's available in paperback or Kindle. But also, you might want to look at some of the resources there, discerning the voices that speak into your marriage. How do we begin walking with God as a couple?
friends see through marriage as well as some of the other aspects of marriage as well. And then even the conversation we just had a minute ago in terms of human sexuality, also some negative issues as well, the signs and seeds of contempt, and how does that surface in some of the conflicts that you might have, and chores and adulting and division of labor. Some of the conversations we've had in the past with our Millennial Roundtable are all found at their website, which is fiercemarriage.com. When we come back, though, we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of communication, because that is so important in a marriage, especially mastering see-through communication as well as creating a culture of vital communication. And then we'll talk about friendships and small groups real quickly before we wind down. Again, the book is published by Baker. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've also made it very easy for you to order it as well. Ryan and Selena Frederick with us. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, Ryan and Selena Frederick with us as we talk about their book, See Through Marriage. And Ryan, let me come to you because you wrote some of these chapters here on communication. And it seems to me that let's, if we can, help people understand what maybe some of the marks, some of the identifiable traits of good and vital communication in a marriage are all about.
Yeah. So, sorry, 1 second here. Okay, sorry, I almost put you on mute. So sorry. So one of the things that really struck me about doing the research for this chapter was I came across a study where they basically did a study of all, over 10 years of hundreds of couples. And they were able to predict with 90% certainty if that couple was going to succeed or not based on one thing alone, and that's how they handled communication, and specifically communication around conflict. So I'd say, like, in terms of a culture of see-through vital communication, conflict is going to be kind of the big red flag or the big place where you're going to want to pay attention. Then they debunked a lot of the kind of assumptions that we have, right? Because a lot of couples would assume that who I marry has a lot to do with whether or not I'll have a happy marriage. And the study actually debunked that. And actually go through a number of these assumptions that are too common but are often not true.
And so, again, whether one of the things they surfaced is the issue of contempt, which, by the way, you have some sections about that in your website. And it does seem to me that you see sometimes a situation of escalation. It starts out with you didn't put the cap on the toothpaste, and pretty soon your mother-in-law is, a beast, or it is withdrawal and avoidance and those kinds of things. And so a lot of this gets back to this idea of transparency, the willingness to stay in the conflict, to stay in the conversation, not to retreat from it, but not to escalate it either. And so in some respects, these chapters on communication are so vital because that's usually where the breakdown in a marriage really takes place, doesn't it?
Yeah, contempt is such an ugly thing. It really is. I heard one researcher define contempt as kind of a perfect blending, perfect's the wrong word, but a blending of anger and disgust toward another person. And really, I think the only way around contempt is to start with the gospel and to realize that we are on the same plane in terms of we're both sinners and we both need grace and we both have grace in Christ. Therefore, how dare we not give grace to one another in the same spirit that we've received it from our Savior. And then from there, I think it's just a matter of being really intentional, right? And intentionality is one of these words that kind of tends to be overused in Christian circles because if you're doing something, it's intentional, right? So why call it intentional? But intentionality meaning go out of your way to actually do these things. And the first piece is having and acknowledging an intentional baseline in the sense that we are both going to submit ourselves to this truth that we are sinners in need of grace and we have grace in Christ, but we have biblical authority that's going to govern how we talk to each other. We're not going to go outside of saying things according to how the Bible instructs us to do that. And then there's a few other intentionalities we go through, like asking each other intentional questions and kind of setting the baseline in terms of our tone and knowing which tones tend to press big red buttons so that you're not escalating. Like you said, you're not just squeezing the toothpaste further out of the tube, but you're actually de-escalating in the name of Christ-like love and sacrificial love, even when it feels right to let it escalate.
Selena, let's, if we can, talk about small groups, because you wrote that chapter, and this idea that what the Bible says about groups is important. And then even you have a section there about fierce community. We've been talking about fiercemarriage.com, but also this idea of really working through some of these conversations. And so how does a small group idea fit within a marriage?
Yeah, absolutely. Early on in our marriage, I'd say we've been involved in some small groups, but it really was more around the teaching versus being known. And I think, again, you have to be careful about where the focus is, right? Are we being known to be known and that's the end of it? No, we're being known to be able to be pointed back to Christ in those areas that we're struggling in. And so I would say that we've honestly experienced transparency in our small group very recently in our marriage. So we've been married 17 years, and I'd say probably the last 3 to 5 years we've actually experienced what we would probably call true transparency within a small group. And being known as a couple is right. There's got to be some boundaries, and I think this is where we talk about secrecy versus privacy, right? We're not going to just air out all our dirty laundry for everyone to see, but we are going to own maybe some of the sin that we have been, engaging in, right? Yes. And, our small group kind of breaks up into guys and girls every other week, and then we have, a small group all together. And so identifying what topics and how deep you go into those, just basic tools within a small group, I think can be really powerful for people to understand, what's appropriate, what's not, how far do we go, and what do we talk about. We have a lot of that kind of in the book. And that's part of being, that fellowship in the light, walking in the light.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that because you have a section on privacy versus security, or secrecy, I should say, and what should you share and those kinds of things. So just a lot of very practical material. But we're just about out of time. So, Ryan, let me, if I can, for just a minute, encourage people to go to fiercemarriage.com. That's where they can find out about the book. That's where they can find so many other resources. But just for the moments that we have left, talk about what's available at your website for any of our listeners.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Yeah, at fiercemarriage.com, you'll obviously find our blog, which we do have content that comes out there weekly. We also have a podcast that we've really enjoyed doing. It's been kind of it's been an unforeseen joy in our own marriage. We get to get together every week and talk about Jesus and how the gospel applies to marriage. That's just on iTunes or Spotify, or you can just go to fiercemarriage.com/podcast for that. We have books and things at our website as well.
And so, again, some great resources at Fierce Marriage. And, again, it's fiercemarriage.com. This book, again, about 200 pages. Like I said, there's 15 chapters. We've covered a good number of those. But at the end of each chapter, one of the things I was appreciating is that you have maybe a Bible verse to read, and then maybe some comments about this, and then some maybe applications. So the way you've put this together, if somebody is teaching a small group or a Bible fellowship or something like that, you've really constructed this so that this could be something they could teach on a weekly basis. And so talk about how they might be able to use that in an effective outreach to couples within their church.
Yeah, I mean, you just nailed it. We try to make it really practical and really kind of turnkey in that regard. But I think more than anything, it comes down to understanding the power of having these kinds of conversations within the church body, right? Someone once said, if you want to hear God's voice, read the Bible. If you want to hear God's voice out loud, read the Bible out loud. I would also argue that if you want to be touched by God or experience God's touch, then I would say be involved in the body of Christ, right? Be involved in the church in this context. So, yeah, and I mean, you just nailed it. Go through each chapter, read a scripture, ask questions, but more than anything, have honest conversation.
Well, again, Ryan and Selena, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. And again, one last time, the book is entitled See Through Marriage, Experiencing the Freedom and Joy of Being Fully Known and Fully Loved. And it is published by our friends at Baker Books. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby.
Let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to spend some time looking at, first of all, the importance of Christian philosophy, and we'll have a chance to talk with Dr. Tim McGrew and Dr. Doug Groteis. And then in the next hour, we'll look for just a little bit of time at what has been put together by our friends at the Heritage Foundation on 160-plus different recommendations on actually reestablishing what we have been really missing by locking our country down. And just before we run out of time, let me just mention that in addition to the information we have about Ryan and Selena Frederick, we also have this very good article written by Chuck Bentley, Time to Practice COVID Capitalism. I think you'll appreciate that one as well. So all those resources available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew for engineering the program today, for Steve for producing it, and we will see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.